Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Brandon Tilt, and this is another episode of Feather of Light podcast. Today, I don't really have a particular topic in mind. I feel like there's a couple topics that I'm really curious of and really eager to explore more, but feel like there's a little bit more research involved. So I'm kind of holding off on really diving deep into those topics until I feel like I've reread some books that I've read, or maybe just kind of like got more of a general understanding of some of the specific topics I want to bring in. So here we're just kind of jumping in, unprepared, kind of spontaneous. And I feel like these topics are kind of fun too, right? Like these days, these podcasts, these episodes where I just don't have anything in mind. That's how the other one came about. It became a really rich discussion on the philosophy of mind and, talking about systemic thinking and stuff like that. But I suppose to pull this in some direction, I feel like a lot of my life I've been kind of drawn towards looking at politics, but not necessarily speaking from a political voice, trying to, on some sense, drown out certain aspects of the chatter and the noise, but at the same time recognizing that we live in a society, and some cultures more than others, but we live in a society where there's a lot of oppression, right? So maybe this is the topic, because it's been something that's cycling back to me a lot. I've been kind of thinking a lot about the war in Ukraine and Russia, and they're sort of, how I'd say both sides are being oppressed in that way. I am a half Ukrainian man, so, just feeling the pain of that, and thinking about how my ancestors, like, what their experience was leaving Ukraine, and the stuff that's going on in Gaza is horrific. All the war crimes, all the pain, the devastation of this, drone pilot pushing a button, and the degree of the form of PTSD that would come about from that. That would be a form of trauma that would be interesting to reflect on when you're kind of playing like a video game, right? You think you're kind of playing a video game, but you realize that there's a real person that's died as the result of you clicking that button. But anyway, and then in addition to that, thinking a lot about the Amazon jungle lately, right? Just thinking about all the fires, thinking about how there's certain people like Paul Rosalie, I follow him on Instagram, who go and actively preserve all these ancient rivers and are exposing so much of the logging that's being done on these ancient rainforests, and just all the frontline activism in, I'd say, tandem with a lot of biological research, right? He's a biologist, some sort of plant life ecologist. And just the efforts to protect the Amazon, and just how much turmoil is going on there, how much oppression is actively going on within these countries of, like, say, Peru and Colombia and Venezuela and Brazil, and places I haven't been but plan to visit one day. So I guess this is just like a bit of a survey to kind of like give you some context as to why I'm feeling like there's just this need to have this conversation. So without getting too political, I would just really like to explore the topic of oppression, very generally speaking, and not for sake of creating this kind of finger wagging, fist waving kind of anger. I don't want to actively get people to a position where they're feeling triggered and they're just kind of sitting with that anger. So maybe just before I get into this topic, I really just want to maybe trigger a warning in a way that if this is a topic that feels like it might bring up a lot for you, please tend to your needs. By no means do I want people to kind of just keep on powering through this discussion, feeling like their body's being neglected, or they're not sitting with the experience of anger, or on some level maybe they're feeling kind of disembodied throughout this experience of listening to this podcast, I want you to check in with yourself actively around this word and this topic, right? What comes up for you in your body's experience when we talk about oppression? When you start to actively explore the ways to which you experience oppression in your, maybe your life, in your house, or it could be in your community, or of course the broader context of within your social system or your political system. Coming from someone who is, by the way, very privileged to live where I live and to experience the level of shelteredness in a way from that, right? I don't live in parts of Vancouver where there's a lot of addiction and a lot of people dying from fentanyl overdoses. And I don't live in parts of South America where there's just so much oppression that there needs to be like constant, let's just say like rebellions to kind of offset the level of control the government has over people. I mean, I'm also not completely exempt from oppression, for sure. There's forms of oppression that exist within my life, but I just want to really make it clear that as a white male living in Canada, goddamn, do I have it good in terms of the degree of oppression I experience is so much less than so many other marginalized communities, so many other cultures, and of course, other people with different cultural identities or, gender or ethnic identities. What they experience on a daily basis or a weekly basis is entirely different from my experience. But I just want to bring awareness to this topic, this very challenging, what can be very challenging topic for some people to talk about, because there's probably so much anger linked to it, or maybe there's shame linked to it, or maybe there's an intergenerational wound that really starts to become known and felt within the body. And this is kind of where I'm coming from in terms of being half Ukrainian. My direct family has not experienced the oppression of these regimes that existed in Ukraine when my family was present, right? There is no memory. I have no conscious memory of escaping some kind of occupation or the types of trauma that my family would have experienced while living in Ukraine and had to escape. And even just the degrees of discrimination or the challenges of immigration that they would have experienced coming to Canada at a time in, I'd say, the late 1800s, where it was probably a lot less accepting than it might be today. And I mean, I challenge that a little bit. There's probably a large variety within what parts of Canada are more accepting to immigrants and what degree to which you could even really define what that acceptance looks like. That being said, this is all just kind of in a sense, a memory that exists deep within my unconscious, right? When I work with my stored trauma, like when I drank ayahuasca in Peru, I remember having a vision about, it was more kind of like my body brought up this feeling and this emotion, and I felt it very viscerally about my grandpa on my dad's side in the war, fixing planes, and kind of this experience of being exposed to all this trauma, like the vicarious trauma of being in a war, World War II, and the heaviness of that experience, being someone who has some kind of Ukrainian lineage. I've had dreams, I've had various things surface that have, to me, felt like I've in part experienced a thread of this oppression of my ancestors, and how different that is. I just want to really speak to how different that is than people who are actively experiencing oppression today. And that is their everyday, or that is something they experience so commonly that they don't even really know. They don't even really know how to react in a way, I'm assuming, right? It's like, it's in a sense kind of normalized, or maybe ideally not, but maybe for some it becomes internalized. It becomes a type of shame. And this is where I bring awareness to this so that people can recognize that that is not inherently true, right? There's nothing wrong with you. There's no need to feel shame for being different and having a different cultural identity. You can be proud of the fact that you're in a new place experiencing something different than maybe your parents or your grandparents experienced. And you're breaking those cycles in different ways, right? You're making a better life for your next generation, or for the next 7 generations, right? When you think of when you think of healing intergenerational trauma, from my understanding, it's for the next 7 generations, right? That's how the indigenous people viewed it. You're breaking these cycles, and you're doing it for the next 7 generations. And I would say that these people who are immigrating, right, from these war-torn countries or places where the oppression is too much, or maybe they just want a different chance at economic success, right? Varieties of reasons. They're doing it for the next 7 generations. They're doing it for the same reason that we heal, or I heal, the deeply stored trauma within my lineage. And there's a kind of kinship within that, don't you think? Like, we all really just want what's best for our kids and our kids' kids. And ultimately, we're just trying to create safety for this little child that comes into this world fresh and exposed to so much external threats and stimuli, and just trying to create that degree of safety and love and community, and just want that acceptance, maybe for ourselves, but on some level for our children, right? We want to be in a community that accepts us, but also creates safety and connection and acceptance and stability for our children, who maybe don't understand why people look at them differently, right? Those who don't have, I would say, acceptance, and are biased and are prejudiced, who just look at another person's child, an innocent child that hasn't done anything wrong to anybody, and maybe just aren't able to see them from a place of, that's another person's, like, everything. That is an embodiment of love and innocence. That's just it, right? How can we return to this place of just appreciating that everybody on some level, not every single human that exists, but we're all just trying to protect the innocence of our children, or those who we feel deserve that respect and dignity. So then, maybe taking this back to the topic of oppression, I tangent a bit in terms of maybe focusing more on like family values and the challenges of immigration, that from my understanding, which is very limited, but just trying to reflect on this and have a sort of an open understanding of it, just feels like it's about this preservation of innocence and creating community around their children, for themselves as well, but ultimately for sake of their children and their next generation. And then how oppression on some level is like this force that comes down and puts weight on, well, everybody, but on some level it focuses more towards, I would say, those that are more vulnerable. But there's also different forms of oppression, and I feel that's an important thing to recognize, where we can just speak to, on the surface level, there's poverty, right? There's economic oppression. There's, oppression using fear, right? Like look into some of these criminal organizations and stuff, or just anarchist political groups, like all this stuff. It's like there's a level of oppression using fear. Your physical safety becomes at risk, but then of course it can become about economics very quickly. But then, yeah, just the degrees of oppression that exist within social media that are kind of like tactics of control, the ways to which when you get online, like where your attention is going, the emotional responses that are being elicited, you're in a sense being externally influenced to oppress yourself, right? There's this interesting effect, or I suppose just there's this way to which we start to basically just kind of like gatekeep and control and divide within ourselves. And I would say this is very much related to a manager part. If you look to Part's work, right, which I like to reference here and there, there's this way to which so many of these social systems and corporations and political systems, they're so good at hijacking these parts of us that just desire control and safety, and will get it done by not any means necessary, but they will take whatever they can get, right? If there's a way that they can create that safety that's most accessible to them, to those parts, they will utilize it, right? It makes sense. And I feel like social media especially, it really takes hold of and manipulates our manager parts, which are the ones that are trying to kind of like tell us what degree of control we need to introduce into our life to really keep our internal system safe, right? To prevent ourselves from stepping, on the wrong mine, so to speak. That's that is a metaphor, obviously, but just avoiding the dangers that will blow up in our face. And how I would say that these parts become polarized, these manager parts, because they want to control things, they want to restrict us, but when they become polarized, they're kind of like doing so using extreme measures. It's kind of like, I would say a manager part that's been well integrated and well, let's just say, it's been introduced to the world in a way that's balanced. It's aware of the need to control, and on some level, it will still dictate how you show up in the world, but it's not being influenced in a way where it's taking these extreme measures to do so. It's not like barricading your house for some fear that everything's just going to go to shit and you're going to have to fight for basic necessities. It's like, that's actually a really good metaphor, because we kind of do this emotionally, right? We create these barricades. We hammer up all the walls, and all the doors and all the windows get reinforced so strongly, because there's this fear of this catastrophe. There's this fear of the world ending, emotionally, maybe literally, but there's this fear that something so catastrophic is going to happen to us that we need to really have this like inner sanctum walled off, and essentially like a fortress, right? Our mind and our body becomes something of a fortress. And I would say that that's the result of oppressive systems hijacking our manager parts to be like, yeah. You got to have that inner fortress. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. Good system. Sounds great. I'm not going to sit here and, tangent this into something that's about a conspiracy as to why they do this. I'm sure your guess is as good as mine. But that's just definitely worth noting, that oppression does feel like it's ultimately just working with how our internal system receives these external messages and experiences that are designed to control us. And it's kind of like certain things objectively have the capacity to change our life. That's just how it is, right? Certain conditions within our environments that are controlling us physically or economically or socially or politically, those are things that I'm not going to sit here and deny are influencing billions of people every day. That is just, I would say on some capacity, things that are debatably outside our control, right? Without political revolution or some degree of rebelling and creating social reform, right? Those are larger social and philosophical and political shifts that are necessary to change those things. But I would say it starts internally. There's a necessary internal shift for what is within your control, right? How can you reframe yourself? You see that meme where you see the guy on the train to the two guys on the train, and they're kind of each looking out a window, and one of them's looking at the world and being like, wow, look at all this beauty, holy fuck, and he's smiling. And the other guy's looking out there, he's like, oh my God, the world is just this miserable, dark, and gloomy place. And I would say that the subtle difference is that one person has on some level allowed, I would say, these manager parts to be introduced to the world in a way that doesn't, let's just say, proliferate or reproduce the narrative of fear, the narrative of oppression that exists within you. And, I would say many of us, that we play this story, we play this reel within ourselves that isn't directly saying like, yes, oppress me. Yes, the world needs to control me. I want to be oppressed. It's something I would say that's more connected to your personal views about the world or how your parents brought you up. But there's some kind of narrative that plays under the surface that leads to a level of self-oppression. Like, you have to be susceptible to their lies in a way. You have to be susceptible to some degree of psychological manipulation. And by the way, I'm not going to make that as a broad, sweeping statement either. I know for a fact this is a very sensitive subject when it comes to abusers, emotional abuse, physical and sexual abuse, right? And I speak to this very broadly, and I will speak to this more in depth in a different podcast. But yeah, there's something there about our internal working beliefs creating this susceptibleness to be exploited or abused or oppressed. And in some situations, it's just like we fit that criteria for whatever form of manipulation exists out there. They're kind of putting out the hook, right? Someone's kind of laying out their hook. And, to follow this metaphor, we're kind of just like fish that are searching for a nibble of something that tastes good to us. But, I've tangented a bit, but it does feel like, it's worth noting that there's the forms of oppression that we are just inherently exposed to, depending on our culture, depending on our identity, right? Our ethnic identity or our expression of who we are, where we live in the world, how susceptible we are to certain risks. And then on some level, there's the deeper layer of how those external oppressions program us in a way to become more susceptible to being oppressed further, right? Where we essentially start to internalize the shame of oppression and become self-oppressive. So there's a beauty to recognizing this. There's a capacity to liberate oneself within this, because you can recognize that, yes, you can't change what's outside your control, right? The external oppression will still exist, but the internal capacity to liberate is always there. This is emphasized very deeply in Stoic philosophy. Your internal capacity for freedom and autonomy and choice, and to change these narratives around oppression, is inherently there. Viktor Frankl speaks to this very profoundly in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. And also he speaks to it in The Doctor and the Soul, one of his other books. And it's really just this idea that you can be in the most oppressive conditions, right? Viktor Frankl wrote about his experience in Auschwitz, the darkest, just the worst example of human nature playing out possible, right? These internment camps. And he spoke to how he had this drive and he developed this capacity to survive the just brutal, most unforgiving conditions through this lens of inner drive and inner freedom and inner motivation to write his book, to continue this idea, to bring forward this inner sense of freedom and empowerment that he felt so deeply motivated by. And this goes to like the ability of spirit. One can call it mind and motivation, but I would say it's a spiritual thing, to really allow a person to power through what are the most unforgiving conditions to the body, where a person in many ways would just have died long ago. The spirit powers through, the spirit charges through. The spirit is so much stronger than just the pure physical stamina of the body itself. And I feel like this is such a beautiful way to connect this, because how can you tap into the spirit when you're feeling like you're at your low points, when you're feeling like you're at your limit, when you're feeling like the system has beat you, or there's no way out? And so to continue this, I would say the theme of this discussion, or as I started off on the theme of oppression, I really want to speak to the importance of and the power of spirit, the human spirit, in overcoming oppression, in overcoming adversity, and how we've recognized spiritually or historically how spirituality and one's ability to tap into spirit is this driving force that can allow people to overcome pretty much anything. It's like there's this ability to tap into this reserve of superhuman energy, and how many of these oppressive systems, they want to create an environment where your spirituality is starved and you don't have access to this driving force. And they, in a sense, weaponize spirituality so that we're feeling further disconnected from spirit and not allowed to access this powerful life force. Yeah, I would say there's a lot of ways to which we've seen this played out in various narratives. An example I looked to most recently I guess it just kind of added context to my understanding of oppression and revolution, is in the French Revolution, depicted in Les Mis. Yeah, Les Miserables. Les Miserables, I think. I don't speak French. Just the way the system was just so deeply oppressive, and the people felt like they needed to really fight. And this underlying theme of connecting to, of course, the faith of the Catholic Christian religion was kind of interwoven within this. But I would say the spirit really existed within the people. The spirit really existed within the willingness to fight and come forward and gather in community and to be empowered. And it's just time and time again, I see this sort of way to which spirituality and it being removed from a culture in a way. Like you look to the oppression of the indigenous people, in Canada, the colonization in Canada and the US. And I know that colonization is something that has been experienced historically in all different parts of the world, but I live in Canada, and I just really want to speak to the nature of how the Indigenous people have been displaced and their spirituality being outlawed, and what that does to a culture, the degree of control. It's like it is a power play, right? They control whether people are able to gather in ceremony or how they do so, not exactly as much that they can or can't do so, but how they do so. And it's removing some degree of spiritual empowerment that I would say is so important for people to have strength and resilience versus oppression. So, whatever example you want to look to, I would say there's just a necessity for us to reclaim our relationship to spirit for sake of this internal programming I've talked about, right? Overcoming these oppressive beliefs or, ways to which we oppress ourselves. But then at the same time, tapping into this deep wealth of spiritual energy that can allow us to overcome things emotionally, physically, in all these ways that we just feel completely incapable of doing otherwise, right? The feats that humans are able to accomplish when they are fully attuned to this well of spiritual energy, source, knowledge, wisdom. And what happens when we're disconnected from that same source? What happens to us and our capacity to live our lives in an autonomous way, or be connected to those that we love, or really feel connected to, it could be the elements, it could be the deities and forces and gods that are surrounding us, or it could just be the forces of nature and I would say, the natural world itself. So what would I encourage you to take away from this? Well, firstly, what ways are you oppressing yourself? What ways might you be replaying old narratives that are a remnant of a past time, or a remnant of a past identity, or potentially a remnant of a past generation that's replaying this old reel? And then additionally, what ways can you tap into spirituality for means of empowerment, for means of finding your voice and embodying your most deepest authentic sense of self, so that you can go out there and be a beacon? So you can go out there and not just heal internally, but support other people in their path, whatever that looks like to you. It doesn't have to be being a mental health provider. That's the archetype that we are familiar with in the West. But how can you embody a deeper relationship to spirituality, be empowered, and rid yourself of these self-oppressive narratives and beliefs, and then go out there and encourage other people to go out there and just live a free existence, be spiritually liberated, be liberated within the mind, be liberated within the body. So I encourage you to get curious. And as always, I appreciate the support. I appreciate anyone who feels called to tune in and listen and open your heart and open your mind. And I just want to say I appreciate you and offer you a heartfelt thank you. Keep doing the work. Keep doing the work. Keep being of service. Aho metta kwaye oyasin. We are all one. Thank you, my friend. Take care.